Welcome to our third lecture on the Kaiser years. Today we will examine the question, why was the Kaiser forced to abdicate in 1918? Firstly, we will examine the early optimism of the German people since they were led to believe that the war would be short and victorious. Secondly, we will examine the impact of the British naval blockade on the lives of ordinary German people. Then we will examine the gradual increase of protest against the Kaiser and his government throughout World War I. And finally, we will examine how these protests came to a head and resulted in the Kaiser's abdication. In the lead-up to the war, government propaganda promoted the country's military prowess in order to instill patriotism in the people. Therefore, many young men enrolled to join the army. There was a common belief across Europe that the war would be over by Christmas. Nobody expected it to escalate into the greatest war that history had seen up until that point. Therefore, many people in Germany were optimistic at the start. This recruitment poster shows the optimism and patriotism well. The soldier is young, strong and willing to defend his country. The caption states that, "Your fatherland is in danger," to give a sense of urgency and desperate need. However, there were similar posters used to recruit young British soldiers. They had a similar sense of patriotism and optimism that Britain would win the war by Christmas. Conscription is the term used for when someone is forced by the state to complete military service. Germany had a strong military heritage, so conscription existed even before World War I. All men aged over 20 were expected to complete 3 years of service before returning to civilian life. In 1914, the age was lowered to 17. It was an expectation that all men aged 17 to 46 would enroll for military service. When the war broke out, the army grew in 12 days, from 800,000 to 3.5 million men. However, this meant that those left behind had to keep the wartime economy afloat. These were called civilians. Women, teenage boys and men beyond retirement age were expected to work in the munition factories or in traditional rural industries, like farming. Most were happy to do this in 1914. Because they believed the war would be over by Christmas. It became clear by 1915 that swift victory would not come. The Allied troops put up high resistance. Trench warfare began, and by 1916, the Western Front was at stalemate. The most important development for the civilians left behind was Britain's naval blockade. Since Britain won the naval race, they used their dreadnoughts to cut off Germany's access to the North Sea. This meant they could no longer import food from abroad and had to become self-sufficient. Most of the food produced in Germany was directed to the troops on the Western Front. Therefore, rationing had to be introduced. Rationing began in January 1915 and became increasingly worse as the war drew on. The winter of 1916 to 1917 is known as the turnip winter. As the potato harvest failed, so turnips were the principal ingredient in most people's diets. This is a root vegetable that before had been used to feed cattle. By 1917, a person's daily intake was reduced to 1,000 calories and starvation was rife. This had a profound impact on the public health of the German civilians. Malnutrition resulted in a weak immune system. When the Spanish flu arrived in 1918, people did not have the natural strength to fight the disease. As a result, approximately 250,000 people died of the Spanish flu. The desperate conditions that people were forced to live in resulted in social unrest. This grew gradually throughout the war but came to a boiling point in 1918. As early as 1915, 500 women gathered in protest to demand the return of the troops from the front. This is because they were struggling to manage their household and their new jobs in the factories at the same time. This discontent increased by 1916 when 10,000 Berlin workers marched to the Reichstag chanting, "Down with the war, down with the government." By 1918, riots broke out across all the main cities in Germany. Desperation had resulted in civil unrest and a call for the Kaiser to abdicate. The Kaiser was then placed under pressure by an esteemed army general called Ludendorff. He bade the Kaiser to give away some of his power to the Reichstag since he believed that the Allied powers would treat Germany more favorably if the Kaiser agreed to the introduction of democracy. France and America were both republics, while Britain was already a constitutional monarchy with a democratic system. However, the Kaiser did not heed this advice. In October 1918, a mutiny took place of sailors on the High Seas Fleet, in the port of Kiel, to the north of Germany. The army sent soldiers to put down the mutiny, but they joined the mutineers. This was the beginning of the end. When soldiers refuse to follow orders or fight for their king and country, it is game over. In addition, city workers were not willing to support a constitutional monarchy. They wanted a full revolution. There was a fear by this point that there would be a communist revolution, like the Russian Revolution that had taken place in 1917, resulting in the death of Tsar Nicholas and his family. At the start of November, the Kaiser officially abdicated. When a king abdicates, they voluntarily give up the throne. He went into exile and bought a large residence in the Netherlands for him and his family, a much happier ending to his rule than the ending for his cousin Tsar Nicholas of Russia. The Social Democratic Party then set up a provisional government under their leader Friedrich Ebert. Provisional means temporary. They would need to create a constitution in order to become the legitimate and permanent government of the country. In 1917, Russia had been under the control of a provisional government following Tsar Nicholas II's abdication when the Bolshevik Party had staged a violent communist takeover. Therefore, Ebert and his party knew that they needed to act quickly and decisively to secure their position. On the 11th of November, 1918, the provisional government signed the armistice with the Allied powers in Champagne in northern France. This was a secret location and the armistice was actually signed on a train. The new leaders of Germany were in a desperate position. The head of the German High Command, Paul von Hindenburg, had written to the new leaders to encourage them to sign the armistice even if the Allied demands were impossibly high. The delegates who boarded the train only had 72 hours to read the agreement before signing it and so could make very few amendments. This was a necessary evil in order to prioritize the widespread civil unrest across Germany, which would only worsen while ever Britain's naval blockade was still in place. The armistice was signed a little after 5 a.m. on the 11th of November, but it came into effect at 11 a.m. This is why even today we have a minute's silence at 11 a.m. on the 11th of November. Let's now return to our overarching question of why was the Kaiser forced to abdicate in 1918. Remember, it was the Kaiser and his echo chamber of Prussian generals that drove Germany toward a war with the Allied powers. Government propaganda stoked a strong sense of optimism and patriotism, so young men were happy to enroll and fight for their country. This means that the buck had to stop with the Kaiser when Germany lost the war. During the 4 years of war, the German people had been subjected to strict rationing due to food shortages brought about by Britain's naval blockade. This had resulted in outbreaks of disease like the Spanish flu and desperate poverty. As a result, civil unrest had escalated as the war continued. Firstly, the women simply wanted their husbands back from the front. Then, as the situation worsened, city workers joined in and called for governmental reform. By 1918, riots were widespread across the major cities of Germany and the sailors of the German Navy were at the point of mutiny. This meant that the Kaiser was left with no choice but to abdicate because an offer of more democracy was simply not good enough at this stage. The provisional government then had to act quickly to end the war so they could focus on stabilizing the country. However, as you will learn in the next lecture series, This caused huge long-term problems for the new government, who struggled to gain the trust of the German people after accepting such a huge defeat at the hands of the Allies. Thank you for listening. This is the final lecture in a short series on the Kaiser years. Tune into my workshop to look at how you can apply this knowledge and understanding to an interpretation analysis question. The next series of lectures will then cover the Weimar years from 1918 to 1933.